Hello. Welcome to March. March is PKI Insights webinar. I'm Nick Circlebit. We got Mark. This month, we are covering a topic of energy utility, cybersecurity in critical infrastructure environments. Let's see, I'm going to go in and do our formal introductions in case anyone new is on. Mark, welcome. Thanks again for joining.
Absolutely. Excited to be here.
Yep. And again, my name is Nick Colbert, and on the business development side, just a little bit of a couple of housekeeping items again as a reminder. One thing that I love about these is how engaged everyone is in our in our chats. And also in the question and answers. We take pride in hearing from you. We love hearing from you and the thoughts that you guys have as we're presenting on this topic. This is a topic that you all have asked us as well as we've seen come up in the market. So without further ado, don't forget, comment, chat, say hello. If we can't get to your question, we will respond to you. We'll send you an email post-webinar. Not only that, there'll be a link for everyone, so in case you missed it, you can hear the recording, and look forward to connecting with you guys.
Absolutely. And there's a chat and Q&A area, as Nick mentioned. So if you have questions, you can submit them there. And we'll do our best to get to them. And if you just want to chat with everybody, that's an option as well. So excited to get started.
Yeah, and you guys can see the agenda here. We're going to cover critical infrastructure protection, and not only that, at the end of this, you'll walk away with not only understanding what the environment looks like today. This is something that has come up you're hearing an uptick in the news, and also in the boardrooms, and also in the IT planning and strategy around cybersecurity, specific to these threats. And we're going to walk you through. So at the end of this, not only will you have a better understanding on how this impacts your certificate environment, but also what you can do about it and how you can get some help. So we'll offer a number of different best practices and also some things for you to walk away with here. That being said, Mark, we didn't do this in the last couple of webinars, and I think we're probably getting our feet underneath us, but love the engagement and the questions, and I love the hellos from all over the world that we're getting, and where you're at, because I think that's cool too. I wanted to do a quick poll. Mark, maybe let's do a poll on, what everyone's environment looks like today, and let's just get a general sense of who we have on the call and who we're engaging with.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what I like about this month's insights is this is kind of a very specialized area, but it's something that applies to a lot of enterprises. But when we talk about the critical infrastructure protection or CIP environments, traditionally this has been something that has been focused in the critical utility space, the electrical utility space, water treatment, gas pipelines. We're starting to see this expand in a number of industries, but it's also very similar to what companies have from an industrial control system, if they are in the manufacturing space, if they're in the automotive space, or even just what they may call OT, or operational technology. It's the portion of the network that is not focused on just the day-to-day operations of the business, the human resources and marketing and sales and those types of things. These network segments are critical to a business operating or providing services to the public. And CIP, at least here in the U.S., has been kind of the gold standard of how organizations should approach cybersecurity controls, how isolation should happen. But what we're seeing is that CIP provided a very basic boundary of all of these critical things must be isolated. It's the first layer of defense. In the electrical utility space, for instance, anything involved in the generation, transmission, and distribution of energy has to be in a CIP environment. And a lot of times that simply means isolated from the internet and lots of other controls around it. So I'm not trying to devalue that. But what we're seeing is in the modern space, those CIP boundaries aren't enough anymore. We're starting to see where Department of Energy is now allowing portions of a CIP environment to now be cloud-based. What? How is that going to happen? It's certainly something that's needed to be more diverse, but it certainly means things that were once behind a walled garden approach are now going to be allowed to have certain components accessible or stored in the cloud. The types of attacks that we're seeing are different now, where it's not just a adversary who is going to be connecting to a VPN with a weak password. The indiscriminate attacks, ransomware, these are all things that have the potential to work their way through various entry points in the CIP environments. And then as some of our utility customers see, as they have OT and CIP environments that include customer premises equipment, as we start talking about things like smart grid. The home electric meters are all intelligent devices with digital certificates deployed by manufactured solutions. Well, that is a very accessible network. Your CIP controls don't necessarily stop someone from going out and accessing some of the signals that are there. So we're seeing the type of challenge is changing. We're seeing more and more of these solutions relying on PKI and digital certificates. You could even say things like Boeing and Airbus. It hasn't been a great couple of months for Boeing, acknowledge that. But an interesting thing over the last several years, every Boeing and Airbus aircraft that's manufactured is either a certificate authority making digital certificates for devices in the plane, or is subordinate to a certificate authority somewhere. That is one big, massive CIP infrastructure if you start thinking about it. And guess what? Now we're sticking lots of people inside of that physical boundary. We have to think differently. And that really moves us to the final point. The traditional method of, hey, I've got a CIP boundary, I've got security controls, and I'll do it all at once in a while isn't sufficient anymore. We have to have real-time intelligence. We have to be able to tell, is something operating inside of my CIP boundary that is cause for concern? Do I have vulnerabilities? Is something exploiting that? Do I have visibility in all other places? And I know one of the things we're going to touch on is one of those places that's often overlooked.
Yep. And Mark, it's so it sounds like and I think for some of us, we've heard the term before. Critical infrastructure has been around for a while. The ability to protect it, same thing. It sounds like for what we're seeing with the customers and so forth, there's sort of an uptick in these new sort of threats. These ones that in the past have been still there, and we've been able to help and assist. Maybe just elaborate on that a little bit more. And then for the group, thank you. I see an uptick in folks joining. Thank you for joining. I just launched our poll. Thank you for filling that out. It helps us understand who we're talking to on this webinar. And again, just please chime in with chats. But Mark, maybe leading into the next, what you talked about with cloud and some of these threats, like what are we specifically seeing as threats now that sort of are changing a little bit compared to what you've seen in the past?
Well, I think when we go back and we take a look at the traditional areas of concern that prompted things like CIP and the reliability of the electrical grid, and even what we're seeing with wastewater treatment and Colonial Pipeline. In many ways, what happened with Colonial Pipeline a few years ago was an interesting thing. Now, at the time, gas utilities do not need or not required to implement CIP infrastructure. I think we're seeing that change. But a great example of where they were impacted from a ransomware attack as opposed to a very deliberate attack. And frankly, a lot of the early thinking when CIP infrastructure was put into place was, how do we stop a terrorist attack? How do we stop a specific adversary who is attempting to undermine the reliability and resilience through exploitation. And that's where CIP really kind of came in. CIP definitely provides some level of protection, and we've certainly have seen that bear fruit over the last several years. But what we're seeing is these types of threats are evolving. It's not just nation states. It's not just direct terrorist attacks. It's kind of what I call the indiscriminate attack. It's simply ransomware isn't always necessarily targeted at something. Companies that are getting exploited through vulnerabilities may accidentally just be accidental fines. So it's not always that an electrical utility or a manufacturing facility is compromised because it was deliberately targeted. It still happens. I'm not saying it doesn't. But we have to kind of think about the types of attacks are evolving, and then also what the roles are. As we have more dependence on things like digital certificates, dependent on PKI, the vulnerabilities, if they're not made aware, become a greater threat, because it's no longer I've got a walled garden, I'm only concerned about what can touch my PKI. We have to assume, and we should assume, that things like CIP is a good designation, but shouldn't define a walled garden approach. We should assume that in a CIP infrastructure, you will get breached. There will be compromise, and we've seen that of all various sorts across utilities, from manufacturing, from the enterprise. But the way that we have to modernize the approach is, yes, keep those CIP boundaries, yes, have those protections, but then how do you start implementing controls so that when you are breached, you're not suffering a catastrophic event? Years ago in IT, we used to call firewalls they had this Twinkie effect, where you would put all the protection on the outside, and just like a Twinkie, all the soft gooey stuff was on the inside. So all you ever had to do was breach a firewall and you're on the inside. What we think about from a defense in depth perspective is, in the CIP infrastructures, we really should be looking at how do we make sure that, in addition to our protections, that we've got visibility of vulnerabilities and also our ability to defend against a breach at some point. Best way of doing that is modernizing our approach. If the threats are changing and they're evolving and they're modernizing, we have to shift how we're doing. We have to get to a point where an audit once a year doesn't do me any good. All that does is tell me what kind of vulnerabilities I've had for the last year in my environment. That doesn't really help. It just means that you were lucky that you weren't breached. What you should be doing is looking at how do I implement real-time visibility? How do I get awareness of what vulnerabilities I have, and are my systems operating according to best practices, so that I know that if a breach does occur, or if I am affected by ransomware, that I don't have a greater issue on hand. So we have to evolve our approach if the threats themselves are evolving.
Yeah, and a couple of things that you mentioned that kind of hit home for me, and then everyone, I just kicked off another poll for us when we look at this. I think we did a webinar on this topic because the word pen test is now mainstream, and it seems like that checks a box for most organizations when it comes to understanding their vulnerabilities,
Yeah.
and then how they effectively consider their plan, their cybersecurity plan. So it sounds like that isn't enough. And then the other topic that I got, it sounds like what you're saying is, what you're saying isn't just for the digital certificates or certificates, and then the PKI that supports it, manages it. This is a different way of looking at the vulnerabilities or the environments, correct? And
Yeah.
it's a different mindset that you need to have. Pen test might be good, but there's this
Yeah, I think the interesting thing that we find is, organizations, almost all of them do pen tests. What's the number one thing that we could pretty much count on always fails in a pen test? The PKI. And it's not like these are necessarily unknown entities. And one of the best things that we can see is, as companies modernize their approaches, they're starting to be told, hey, you know what, your PKI actually didn't fail the pen test. And some of the pen testing companies are actually saying, with this new approach, we don't have other customers that ever pass this part. So that's kind of a testament that if the pen testers know that this is a weak spot, guess what? So do the adversaries.
Right. Um, and if I just moving here, you touched on a couple of other things too, kind of moving into the new way, the new approach.
Yeah.
And this isn't just geared at PKI. This has to be this has to be a new way of incorporating what's been, sounds like, from what we've heard from our customers and some of the projects and even what we're doing with Spotlight. But there's this unawareness of these lurking misconfigurations that, quite honestly, in the past, you did, I think folks on the call on this webinar are also aware. What's the big deal? I mean,
Yeah.
it can wait. Mark, why can't this, like, I've got so many other dimensions and areas within these environments to secure. What's the big deal?
Well, I think a couple of things. One, it kind of goes back to the trust but verify thing, right? So you bought some tool, you deployed some tool, you got a PKI, you got a firewall, you got a whatever. You trust it's doing its job, but you should be verifying, who's watching the watchers, sort of a thing. I think an interesting thing, and you touched on it here, Nick, is we've been talking a lot with Gartner lately. And they recently kind of recognized that there's kind of this new field of cybersecurity, or this new genre of tools called posture management. We're very focused on PKI posture management, but you could really take that basis and look across anything in the cybersecurity space. And now, if you look at this slide, it doesn't say a thing about PKI. But when we're kind of talking about the modernizing approach, it's about posture management. Is how do you make sure that what you assume your tools and your capabilities and your security is actually what is actually happening on a day-to-day basis in real time? That's the critical thing. This is a very different world than we were years ago, where I could put a security guard on a door, and all I had to do was make sure that the guard was at my door, and I knew we were safe, right? And then we started to go into the digital era. Okay, now I need firewalls so I can keep network traffic off of where I want it to be, or I'll isolate something from the network. It's an evolving type of a threat. Well, as the world becomes more connected, and at the top, I talked a lot about how some BCSI data is now going to be allowed to be stored in the cloud and for CIP environments. That now means it's not a completely isolated segmentation of stuff. Dedicated manufacturing and OT, or in the case of the aerospace, Airbus planes, that's just VPN traffic going over internet connections. It has protections around it, but what are we doing in real time to monitor that information? And that's the only way that we could get ahead, because otherwise the approach that you're taking is, I'm going to deploy a technology, I'm going to hope I don't get breached, and when I do, I'm going to respond. That's the old way about it, and then I'll do an audit once in a while. The modern approach is, have a tool, make sure that you're configured and you're managing your posture, whether that's a very aggressive lean forward with lots of controls in place. Maybe it's somewhere in the middle, but wherever you decide that your posture is going to be, you need something to give you that real-time visibility. You can't rely on out-of-date, once a year or twice a year audits. That's simply a way of having a testament to what's the snapshot of what we have. It doesn't guarantee what tomorrow looks like. Doesn't even necessarily tell you what 6 months ago looked like.
Yeah, and you just introduced a new term, new category from Gartner Research.
I know. Sorry, Nick. We should put it at the top of the deck. But
well, no. What we should do is we'll do another webinar specifically on the topic. But when it comes to posture management and across the environments, and then specifically to PKI. We know that organizations struggle on the topic overall in posture management. Let's see that, but then let's narrowly focus it in on the digital certificates and the environment that supports it. And the one thing that I think hits home with that term, and again, having the Gartner Gartner research to validate it, is for a long time. I know you've been preaching about this, and then as well as the community has been, commenting back. It's not just the certificates. It sounds like posture management also involves a larger subset of what's behind the digital certificates, right?
Yeah.
And so, kind of what this is kind of like a lead in, but it has a little bit to do with this a challenge for organizations to have visibility. I mean, organizations, I think, have challenges even in just visibility in the certificates itself. But sounds like from what you're saying, it's a little groundbreaking in the sense that, hey, look, let's go back, let's look at the infrastructure that's managing these certificates,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Well, I think a couple of interesting things here is looking at our poll. So one of the things that our first poll that we did, Nick, was, do you have a CIP, OT, ICS, or highly secure environment? And it was pretty 50-50. About half of the group has it, half of them don't. And then the other interesting thing was we asked, when was the last time you had the PKI audited for vulnerabilities? And the majority were either I don't know or I'm afraid to know, or 6 to 12 months ago. What that tells you is, even if you're doing these audits, all that you're going to find is what's been wrong for the last 6 to 12 months. It's kind of like driving around with the check engine light in your car. When you finally go into the mechanic, he's going to say, you've been burning up your engine for the last 12 months. Yeah, we could do something about it now, but it's certainly much worse to deal with it now rather than when problems first came up. The other thing is, we had a great question that came in. Beth was asking, does the PKI need to be included in the CIP environment, or it's there to protect components in the CIP? What we typically see in electric utility, in the IT space, OT space, is that there's a PKI just in that environment. And simply because of the fact that the majority of the time there's this walled garden approach where these are highly segmented and isolated systems, which we do encourage. That's absolutely part of the starting, but it's the foundation, it's the starting point. All of the components in there need a secure way of communicating. There's a reason why within CIP we still have things like HTTPS, because we assume at some point an adversary may be in there. There may be unwanted communication. It's not a free-for-all. So it's not that this is a completely vulnerable network segment, but things like the smart meters, as we get out into the fan networks that are doing the communications out into the field. This is a great example of a visibility thing. We have a PKI in the CIP environment. We're doing smart grids, but guess what? The moment that we get to the field area network, that fan environment, for most of our electric utility customers, that tends to be the end of their visibility. We've deployed a lot of PKIs for electric utilities and set them up to be able to facilitate things. But the moment they kind of get to that network that's out in that vulnerable space, the stuff that's connecting the buildings, that's connecting to the smart meters, which, by the way, if you don't know, a lot of water meters are moving to smart metering as well. Interesting conversation to have at some point about how those things work. They don't have a lot of electricity going to water pipes, but they came up with a genius solution. But in any case, for these things, there's a big visibility thing. And one of the things we've been talking to some of our customers about is, how do they extend their visibility into these solutions that may be provided by a manufacturer of the smart grid technology or that fan network. But this is still within your OT environment. Same thing can happen inside of a manufacturing environment. If you're doing an industrial control system or manufacturing, it's not uncommon to have a big portion that's run by a vendor or a separate manufacturer. You shouldn't exclude that simply because they say, oh yeah, we use digital certificates, we're safe. If it was me, if I'm looking at things like my supplier supply chain and trustworthy software or things coming in, I should have full-time visibility across my entire CIP infrastructure and OT infrastructure, even when there's a manufacturer involved. So that means the visibility becomes an issue. And I'm not going to have enough staff. I'm not going to have enough skills. I'm not going to have enough tools. These are all things that you need for visibility. You can either manually have people reviewing the stuff. You can use tools. You can have enough skills. Those are difficult. So that means I have to leverage technology. there's a reason we've gone down this path of automating some of these problems, because you can't do it on your own. You have to find some ways. So the thing that we really want organizations to think about is within these secure environments is start thinking now about how do you expand your visibility. You may not know the tool, you may not know the process, but if there's a dark part of your network in these highly secure parts that you don't have much visibility of, you need to at least figure out what those parts are, and then start conversations about what is in there. How do we get real-time visibility? Don't just give me a once a year audit and tell me things are okay. Don't just tell me, yeah, we've got digital certificates, don't worry about us. You should have a holistic visibility of these environments. And we're starting to see that across all of these CIP infrastructures and OT. You have to assume that vulnerabilities are going to come from anywhere, as well as compromise. So start engaging those vendors if they're in there and say, hey, I want more visibility. Don't just give me, your ISO 27001 statement every year. Where are the certificates? How are you watching them in real time? What tools do you have looking for vulnerabilities? What are you doing in real time? And how are you going to give me visibility? Because that's the only way that we can detect and mitigate these things in real time. It is no longer a world where we can simply hope that everything is secure and then just respond when something goes wrong.
And then let's help the audience out. I think there's a lot of stuff that we said. Hope that was helpful. In wrapping this up, Mark. And by the way, thank you, Beth, for your question. I think we have another question as well. Let's see if we can get this answered.
Yeah, so this is kind of around secure systems engineering.
Yeah.
So there's here's the state of where we're at. When we kind of really start thinking about things like industrial control systems and smart grids and everything else, there's an interesting issue here. This is a very new industry. While we all kind of take it for granted in many things here, I've been to several conferences focused on things like Internet of Things and secure systems. It is a bit like going to a PC convention in the early 80s. There isn't like one holistic standard. There isn't like one operating system dominant player. There are a whole host of approaches and philosophies and concerns. Right now, the vast majority of manufacturers are simply focused on how do I get this stuff to work? And they're taking a stab at security. And we see this all the time from manufacturers that maybe have a smart IoT device, or even the big players like Palo Alto and Cisco. They want to integrate with digital certificates. Sometimes it feels like they take an engineer, shove them into a closet and say, hey, we need this thing to work with digital certificates. And they bang on a keyboard until they have steps that say, hey, I got this certificate to work. And it's doing stuff like making the PKI super vulnerable because now everyone can enroll for a certificate. Well, guess what? Their product works now. They don't really realize what they have pushed. There's not a lot of intelligence behind the scenes. So I think, one, we just have to realize that it is generally an immature industry of making things smart. We've worked with a company that has been around for 100 plus years making cast iron water pumps. These things move massive amounts of waters. The buildings and infrastructure and manufacturing systems dependent on these water pumps, they run for 100 plus years. That's amazing engineering. They have zero history in making them a smart meter with intelligence and security. And then you start factoring things in like, how am I going to make this water pump secure 100 years from now? In the enterprise place, we're thinking, oh, what happens post-quantum? What's going to happen in 2 years from now? Some of this IoT stuff, they're figuring out, what am I going to do in 50 years from now or 100 years from now? That's a whole other set of problems. So I think there's definitely a philosophy of evolving security and having PKIs that are designed for IoT that's secure, doing secure manufacturing. But I think we have a long way to go before we'll ever be able to buy a device, a smart meter, a smart pump, a home thermostat, whatever it is, where we can just blindly trust that it is secure and free of vulnerabilities. We have to realize that these are immature technologies. PKI has been around for a long time, but it's extremely flexible and can be done poorly, which means you have to have that real-time visibility. So I think the answer is there isn't a magic bullet to making everything more secure. The best that we can do is have better visibility of what's happening in there so that we can proactively mitigate vulnerabilities before they become a compromise.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone, for the questions. I think a couple of just key takeaways as we hit the mark on our time. PKI is critical foundational technology. If you're not sure it's a threat, and make sure that you have the visibility into understanding what that threat is, and it's real. Thank you very much for all of you for attending. If there's anything that we can do to help, if there's additional questions that you have our website, you have our email address, you have our phone number, you have both Mark and my direct contacts. And if there's anything we can do to help, look forward to connecting with you. Thank you very much, and look forward to connecting with you all next month for April's PKI Insights. This is Nick Saracolbit.
Thanks, Nick. And I appreciate everyone coming today. This is obviously an area near and dear to us. If you haven't had a chance yet, we recently launched our new website where we've got very specific material and some case studies around how electrical utility in the energy industry is changing how they're approaching some of these risks and how we've helped organizations there. And Nick, I'd probably tag off of something that you said and say, if you don't know if something's a risk, it's a risk. If you don't know it's secure, it's insecure. It is ultimately, without any type of intelligence, you have to assume it's insecure. So I'm looking forward to next month. I think we're talking PKI posture management and what that means. So looking forward to the April event, and we'll have this up on the YouTube channel shortly. And we look forward to talking with everybody next month.